Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Faustine Chan. I'm the Business Innovation Manager for BBB serving the Pacific Southwest. So we've been holding our webinars just to give our businesses useful tools at this time. And this is actually our first Ignite Your Mind Summer Seminar Webinar Series. So welcome and thank you for joining us. We are recording this webinar, so if anytime you do miss any part of it, or if you need to review the information, it will be available on events.bbbcommunity.org. If you do have any questions, please use the chat option or the Q&A, and we will answer those at the end. So we have a fantastic speaker today. We have Rick DeBruhl. He is a familiar face here in the Arizona Valley. His career spans for more than 4 decades on television. That includes 31 years working for Channel 12 here in Phoenix, Arizona. In addition to his local TV work, Rick has covered auto racing for networks such as ESPN, NBC, ABC, and he's the voice of Barrett-Jackson Auctions and the A&E networks. He's also a communications consultant and keynote speaker. Over the past years, he's received many broadcasting and association awards, including 3 Emmys. While that many sound impressive, they fall just a notch behind the Phoenix New Times awarded him the Best Anchor Hair. So please welcome today's speaker, Rick DeBruhl.
Yeah, I think the Anchor Hair Award had more to do with my use of hairspray during that point in my career than anything else. But yeah, it was great working at Channel 12 here. So these days I do communication consulting, talk a lot about communication. We're going to kind of walk through that. And I like to tell stories. So we're going to start off by telling a fun story about communication and what can happen when communication works well. And then we're going to get into some very interesting specifics on the back end. And let's start off by, once again, talking about my theme is always communicating at the right speed. And I'll talk more about why the importance of communicating at the right speed really matters as we go through this whole thing. And you know, to expand a little bit more on the introduction about the fact that, that I did work at Channel 12 here in town. I worked at Channel 12 here in town for 31 years. I also worked for a brief time over in California, but when I first got out of college over at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I had a great career working at Channel 12 here in town, got to interview presidents, rock stars. In addition to working at Channel 12, I also have spent the last 3 decades covering auto racing for TV networks like ESPN, ABC, NBC, Fox Sports, a network called Speed, all kinds of stuff. And these days, I'm a communication consultant. So I work with people and organizations who want to improve their communication. And it's a mix of everything from crisis communication, media training, messaging, internal communication, messaging in terms of presentation coaching, all that kind of stuff. And so if you're interested, you know, you can feel free to reach out to me anytime to learn more about those kinds of things. I'm easy to find. Just go to rickdebruhl.com, or you can email me at rick@rickdebruhl.com if you want to talk more about that kind of thing. But let's get into talking about the issue at hand. And, you know, we keep talking about the fact that it is the, you know, what we're going to refer to as the new normal. And the new normal is complicated because we now have all these employees who are working remotely. I just read an article the other day that was talking about before the pandemic, there was literally in the single digits where they were looking at the number of employees who were working remotely. And they believe that at least 1/3 of all employees are now working remotely right now. And they believe that that number is going to stay even after the pandemic. So it's going to be complicated. And think about these numbers, 80%. And this was a research project done before the pandemic. 80% of employees believe that poor communication is the #1 cause of stress at work. 80% say poor communication is the #1 cause of stress at work. And 63% of employees say they actually want to quit because of poor communication that's causing problems within the workplace. So communication is a critical issue. And there's other research that also talks about the impact of poor communication to the bottom line of an organization. For example, the fact that workers, they call them knowledge workers, basically white collar workers, lose about 3.5 hours of every week waiting for somebody to get back to them because of some communication problem. So if you're waiting for somebody to get back to you, you're not getting the work done. It's almost 1/10 of your work week that is being squandered because of poor communication. Now, all these numbers and statistics I'm talking about were things that existed before the pandemic. And now when we throw this situation where people are now working remotely, they don't have, the office to see people and communicate with, it's complicated things even more. Now, we do have one quick survey question. We don't have a lot of people participating yet. We'll probably maybe ask this again as we go along, but we're going to pop up this quick survey question. The survey question is, with so many employees working remotely right now, has communication improved, stayed the same, or gotten worse? So Faustine, if you can open that survey question, pop it up so everybody can go ahead and participate in the survey. You see it right there. Once again, with so many employees working remotely right now, has communication improved, stayed the same, gotten worse? And what are your experiences with this? Go ahead and submit your results to it, and then we'll talk about the results a little bit later on. We might pop that up again when we get a few more attendees. But in the meantime, I said I was going to tell a story, and I'd like to do that to talk about the importance of communication. The story I'm going to tell involves the Indy 500. I'm a big fan of the Indy 500. I grew up a race fan, as I mentioned. I cover auto racing for various networks, and I was a part of the Indy 500 broadcast team for ABC for about 9 years. And the Indy 500 is an amazing event. It's truly a test of man and machine. It's been going on since 1911. This is the car that won the Indy 500 the very first year. And by the way, the guy that drove that, Ray Haroon, won the race with an average speed of 75 miles an hour, which doesn't seem like much today, but in 1911, it was hugely fast. And they call the track the Brickyard because that year they paved it with bricks. So imagine driving for 6 hours and 45 minutes, that's how long it took, across all those bricks and trying to keep the speed of 75 miles an hour. It was brutal. And by the way, he invented something that he used that day that you use, hopefully, every time you get in a car. If you look very carefully, just above the center number 32 in the car, right in front of the driver, there's this little thing on spindly looking sticks. That's the first use of a rear view mirror in a car. So he's credited with inventing the rear view mirror in cars. Ray Haroon, the very first winner of the Indy 500 back in 1911. And it's made some other people very famous. This is A.J. Foyt. He won the race 4 times. Mario Andretti only won it once, but he's become very famous. He's gone on to some other great spectacular successes in racing as well. And then there's this guy, Helio Castroneves. Helio has won the race 3 times. He's the only driver who will be competing at the race, if they have it this summer when they're scheduling it, who could potentially win it a 4th time. But as I often talk with groups when I have people, I always say, well, how many people remember Helio Castroneves from winning the Indy 500 3 times? And a few people will raise their hand. But when I say, how many people remember Helio Castroneves because he won Dancing with the Stars, well, that's when they get a lot more popularity. A lot of people raise their hands. And as I often point out, it just shows that race car drivers are actually great athletes as well. A lot of people don't realize that. But for every driver that has become successful, there's many more who you've probably never heard of. And this is a perfect example. This guy right here is named Lloyd Ruby. Lloyd Ruby is considered by many people to be the greatest race car driver who never won the Indy 500. And this particular picture is a perfect example. This was the 1969 Indy 500. Lloyd Ruby was leading the race at about the halfway point, past the halfway point, and he came in for a pit stop. And in a pit stop at the Indianapolis 500, what they do is they change the tires, they put fuel into the car, they make any adjustments that's necessary, and then they send him back out on his way. And there's a guy at the front of the car whose job it is to keep track of all that. And as soon as he sees everything's done, he sends them back out. And there was somebody in that situation that day looking at everything. As soon as the tires were on, he signaled to Lloyd Ruby to go back out onto the track. There's just one problem. They hadn't finished putting the fuel into the car. As a result, when Lloyd Ruby pulled away, the fuel hose actually ripped open the side of the fuel tank, and all of the fuel spilled out onto the track on the pit road. And Lloyd Ruby's day was done, all because of a communication failure. That's what cost Lloyd Ruby the race. And by the way, I often point out, you know who won the race that day? 1969 was Mario Andretti. Who do we remember to this day? Mario Andretti. Lloyd Ruby, unfortunately, is a footnote for a lot of people when it comes to racing. All right, so let's move forward. We're going to move forward to 2016. It was the 100th running of the Indianapolis 500. And if there's any math people out there, you're probably doing the math and wondering, well, how come these numbers don't add up? First running of the race in 1911, the 100th running in 2016. Well, that's because they didn't race during World War II or World War I. And who knows if they're going to have a race this year. The plan is to hold one, but things may change between now and then. So the 2016 running was the 100th running. And Everybody wanted to win that race. There was a lot of emphasis on what was going on that particular day. And I want to introduce you to some, well, let's call them characters in the play that we're going to tell this story about. And the first one is this gentleman right here. His name is Alexander Rossi. In 2016, he was a 24-year-old rookie. He had never run at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Was born and raised in California, had come up through what we'll call the minor leagues of racing, done relatively well, went over to Europe, competed there, did relatively well, competed in the Formula One series for 1 year, but he wasn't with a big enough team. So as a result, they weren't doing very well. He decided to come back to the United States and was going to compete in the IndyCar series. And once again, the Indy 500 was only the 6th time he had ever driven in an IndyCar race, and the first time at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And then there's this gentleman right here. His name is Brian Herta. Brian was the team owner for the car that Alexander Rossi was going to drive. Brian Herta is a former driver, had done relatively well, had never won the Indy 500 or a big championship, but had won some races. And he decided at a certain point to move over to the other side of the wall and become a team owner. Up until that point, his team, though, had only won a single race. And his team, boy, it was a bunch of great people. They had great engineers, great mechanics, all kinds of good, solid people. But, you know, speed has a lot to do with money. The more money you have, the faster you can go. And this was a small budget team. In fact, their sponsor didn't even come on board until 2 weeks before. Now, they did have what they call a technical alliance with another team that year, Andretti Racing. So they had some good information. But once again, they just didn't have the budget to be one of those big teams that could win on a regular basis. And there's one other player in this story that I want to mention, and that's me. As I mentioned, I've covered the Indy 500 for 9 years as part of the ABC broadcast team. I'm doing racing for a long time. There's me and Danica Patrick. And that day, I was assigned as one of 3 pit reporters to cover 11 drivers, and one of those drivers was Alexander Rossi. I was responsible for listening to his radio conversations between himself and the pit crew and following him. But, you know, once again, he's a rookie. I figure I'm going to be spending more time paying attention to other drivers who are more likely to win the race, because it's very, very rare for a rookie to win the Indy 500. Now, I want to talk about a really critical thing that came into play that day. I've talked to Brian Herta a lot, the team owner, about how it is that at the end of the race, their team was in a situation to potentially win the Indy 500. And Brian Herta has made it really clear that he has what he calls a culture of communication in his organization. And his team is basically a business, right? They run like a business. But he talked about the culture of communication that existed in his team. And the culture of communication allowed people to bring ideas forward and feel that their ideas would be listened to during the course of an event or during the course of a month. And the culture of communication doesn't start that day, it doesn't start that week or that month. It has to be built into the organization. And here's an interesting statistic to think about. There was a Facebook study just last year that showed that 90% of managers and supervisors believe they have what they've referred to as an open door policy, where employees can come in, bring ideas, and those ideas will be listened to. However, that same survey by Facebook found only 45% of employees felt the same way. So think about that. 90% of the managers thought they had an open door policy, but only 45%, less than half of their employees felt the same way. So if you're going to have that communication culture, you need to make sure that you communicate it properly and that people do indeed feel empowered to step forward and to bring their ideas forward. That communication culture is really critical. All right, let's go back to our story. Everybody starts the Indy 500 pretty much the same way. You know, they want to go as fast as they can, have as few pit stops as they can, have as few problems as they can, and then win the race. But I can tell you it rarely happens that way. And for Alexander Rossi that day, that is exactly the case. This is a picture of Alexander Rossi during one of his pit stops. They came in. Now, he was fast during the first part of the race, but during this pit stop, they came in, they tried to put fuel in. They couldn't plug the fuel hose into the side of the car. It just wouldn't work. It took them an extra 10 seconds. Now, a pit stop in IndyCar racing is only about 8 or 9 seconds. An extra 10 seconds is an eternity. And think about this. It only takes 40 seconds to complete a lap at the Indy 500. So if you lose 10 seconds in the pit, that means you've lost a quarter of a lap. It's a 2.5-mile lap. That means you're almost a mile behind. And then they had another pit stop where they had another problem. The result was, by the halfway point in the race, Alexander Rossi found that he was literally in last place on the track. The last place car still on the track was Alexander Rossi. So the team got together. Remember that communication culture that Brian Hurtis says they have? And they talked about ways to potentially solve that problem. Could they get their guy back up front? And one of the things they decided to do, the one thing they decided to do, was instead of going faster than everybody else, they decided they were going to get better fuel mileage. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could a team possibly win a race by getting better fuel mileage as opposed to just going fast? But let's think about this. Let's go back to that pit stop. Remember, I told you it takes about 8 or 9 seconds, but it actually takes longer than that to complete a pit stop because you have to slow down off the track. There's a pit lane speed limit that's about 60 miles an hour. So you slow down to 60 miles an hour. Out on the track, they're going 225. They got to pull in, do the 8 or 9 seconds worth of service to the car, and then send them back out, still at this pit lane speed limit, accelerate back up onto the track. Before it's all said and done, it takes about 40 seconds to complete a pit stop at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Remember that 40 seconds? That's one full lap. So if you could do one less pit stop, well, it's like gaining one full lap advantage than everybody else. So once again, that communication culture, they came up with this idea, they began to communicate, and they began to talk about how they were going to do this. Now, I'm sure most of you have those new cars where you've got the fuel readout on the dashboard, just like this, and it tells you, you're getting maybe 24 miles to the gallon. Imagine, back when you're driving to work, and I call you up and I say, hey, I need you to get 27 miles to the gallon. Well, the reality is not that hard. I mean, all you have to do is kind of, maybe feather the gas just a little bit, not jackrabbit away from the stoplight. There are things you can do to make it just a little bit better. And that's what they did with Alexander Rossi. And once again, I have headphones on and I'm listening to the communication between the driver and the team as they're explaining it. And they're not just explaining it to them. What they're doing is they're giving them strategies, and they're giving them the strategies at the right time, at the right thing, at the right speed. So this is one of my key themes. Communicating at the right speed is critical because in the case of the Indy 500, your driver's turning laps at 225 miles an hour. You've got to do things very quickly. But the problem is in our modern society, too often what we end up doing is communicating at the same speed for everything. Too often what we don't do is slow things down when we need to. Let's face it, there's times when you need to make a decision. What you really need to do is slow it down, gather more information, talk to more people. But there's also times when you've got a true crisis, for example, where you need to speed it up. But what we tend to do is do everything in about the middle because, well, that's what we're used to. We speed up things we shouldn't, and we slow things down that we shouldn't as well. So communicating at the right speed is critical. And that's exactly what they were doing with Alexander Rossi that day. They were communicating back and forth about the strategies about how to save fuel on the track so that he could get the information. Because once again, the race was only going to last 3.5 hours. He's turning laps at 225 miles an hour. For them, they had to move quickly. But remember, not everybody has to move that fast all the time. Just because your organization can move fast doesn't mean you need to move fast all the time. So they send them back out. They're giving him these fuel strategies of things that they can do to improve as quickly as possible. And he's beginning to learn how to save fuel. It seems hard that you would do that. You can't go quite as fast, but you can stay with the lead pack. And actually, he was able to do pretty well. Now, I want to move forward in the race to lap 164. There's actually 200 laps at the Indianapolis 500. Each lap is 2.5 miles long. On the 164th lap, everybody has to come in for a pit stop. And this is exactly what it looked like. All the cars come in, they get their fuel, they get their new tires, they get whatever adjustments are necessary. Once again, a pit stop, once they pull in, only lasts 8 or 9 seconds, and then they all pull back out. But there's just one problem. At lap 164, they don't have enough fuel to reach the end of the race. An Indy car only has enough fuel after a pit stop to potentially be able to go maybe 30, 31, 32 laps at the most. 36 laps was going to be stretching it quite a bit. So as a result, everybody knew that they were going to have to come in and pit one last time. Unless, of course, that team had been working on fuel-saving strategies for the entire second half of the race, which was exactly what Alexander Rossi's team had been doing that entire time. As a result, they were sitting there beginning to think, okay, how are we going to save fuel? What could we potentially do? But the problem is, before they were saving this much fuel, now they had to save even more fuel. So remember I told you that I wanted you to get, instead of 24 miles to the gallon, I wanted you to get 27 miles to the gallon. Well, imagine I came on your telephone, called you in the morning and said, hey, Now I need you to get 34 miles to the gallon or 32 miles to the gallon. That's when you start to panic. And I was listening, once again with my headphones, listening to the communication back and forth between the team and Alexander Rossi. And I can tell you that Alexander Rossi, when they told him that the fuel mileage number he had to hit, the first thing he said is, there is no way that I can get that kind of fuel mileage. It is just impossible. But you know what they did? They coached him. He's a rookie. They gave him ideas. They gave him methods. They kept communicating the entire time. And what's really critical in all this is they, what I call, communicated the strategy. First off, they formed their strategy, and then they communicated in such a way that he was actually able to understand it. So he knew exactly what they were trying to achieve all along. It wasn't, so they would give what they call a fuel number. In this case, it's like 4.9. That would be the magic number they would throw out. And they'd say, okay, you need to get 4.9 with your mileage reading. And he would say, I can't do that. And say, okay, here's what we want you to do. Try this, try this. And they kept communicating new strategies and ways to do it to be able to pull it off. And the interesting thing is, we discovered that day, Alexander Rossi is not only a really good race car driver, he's really good at saving fuel. And at a certain point in that last stint, as they were going towards the finish line, he suddenly figured out how to improve his fuel mileage in a way that he was able to keep up with the lead pack without falling too far back. Now, there's about 10 cars ahead of him at that point. Almost all those cars, I shouldn't say almost, all of those cars are going to have to go for a pit stop. They believe he's going to have to do the same thing. Now, I want to go forward because as they move forward, his mileage is getting better and better. He's getting the numbers he's going to have to make. The question is, can he make it to the end? At lap 196, all the other cars have now pulled in. There's one car left ahead of Alexander Rossi, a guy named Carlos Munoz. Carlos Munoz pulls in for his very last pit stop. And that means Alexander Rossi is now leading the race. But all the other cars have enough fuel. They know they can make it to the end. Alexander Rossi doesn't know if he can make it all the way to the very end of the race on the fuel he's got. He's trying desperately. So, and this one car, Carlos Munoz, is in second place, and he's going full speed as fast as he possibly can, trying to catch up. Now, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, they refer to it as an oval, but in reality, as you can see, it's a rectangle, okay? And in each one of those corners, they actually refer to as a turn. So they have turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, and turn 4. Now, I want to move to the very last lap of the race. And I will tell you that with about 2 laps to go, I went up to Brian Hurd at the team owner. So I'm in the middle of the broadcast. I go up to Brian Hurd. I've got my headphones on. He's got headphones on. He's trying to communicate with his driver. And in all that noise, I remember asking him, I said, you know, Brian, can your driver go the distance? Can he go all the way? And I remember Brian looked at me and he held up his hand like this. And he did what I call the universal maybe sign. He just thumb kind of shook like that. The problem was they really didn't know if Alexander Rossi was going to be able to finish the race. They had worked so hard. They'd communicated at the right speed. They'd had the right culture of communication. They had the strategy. They did everything the right way. They just didn't know if he was going to be able to make it. So let's go back to this track. The very last lap, Alexander Rossi starts the last lap. Now, remember I said normally they're turning laps of 225 miles an hour. At this point, he's turning laps closer to 200 miles an hour. And as he starts the last lap, the car in second place, Carlos Munoz, is 20 seconds behind him. So Alexander Rossi goes into turn 1, still fully under control. Goes into turn 2, the engine's still running, got fuel. But as they exit turn 3, they realize he's not going to make it. As they exit turn 2 and head towards turn 3, as he pulls through turn 3, the car runs out of fuel. He is within a mile of winning the Indy 500 as a rookie, and the car runs out of fuel. They said instead of going as it went by, it just went whoosh. The sound of the tire rolling over the asphalt, but no engine. But you know, here's the thing. When you're going 200 miles an hour, it's amazing how far and how fast you can coast. And Alexander Rossi not only coasted through turn 4, he coasted all the way across the finish line and won the Indy 500 as a rookie. When he crossed that finish line, his car was going 137 miles an hour. completely out of fuel. He couldn't even make it back around to get all the way to victory circle. And Carlos Munoz, the young guy that was chasing him, finished second, 5 seconds behind. He'd gained 15 seconds in that last lap. But you know what? Another 100 yards, he would have won, but it didn't matter. That's yard of bricks was where Alexander Rossi won the race. And they won it because they did everything right. This is a picture of Alexander Rossi when he was in victory circle. The great thing is they have a lot of traditions. They have the wreath. They have this thing called the Borg-Warner Trophy. And one of the things you do is drink milk. By the way, you get to choose what kind of milk you want. Do you want whole milk, 2%, or non-fat? I believe you chose non-fat that day. But let's go back to those key points that I want to bring up. The fact that it was a communication culture that was built in the organization. It was the ability for those engineers and those mechanics to bring forth ideas that brought forth the idea that enabled them to run that race the rest of the way and to learn how to use those fuel-saving strategies. They were communicating at the right speed. They didn't have time to say, okay, we're going to try something different. We're going to do this. They knew that we have 3.5 hours. Our laps are being run at 225 miles an hour. We need to do this quickly. They sped up to the exact situation they needed to. And then finally, they communicated the strategy. They came up with a strategy and they reinforced it, and they talked their rookie driver through that entire race so that he could communicate so that he could do it properly. And they communicated with him the entire time. Now, there's one more thing that I want to talk about as a part of this race before we get into some of the other elements that's really critical. So this is a picture of Alexander Rossi right after he won the race. You know, he's got the wreath on, the Borg-Warner Trophy and all that. But this is a picture just 1 week later. Alexander Rossi, a week later, having gone through and won one of the most spectacular Indy 500s of all time, is at the Detroit Grand Prix. And that weekend, there were 2 races at the doubleheader, a race on Saturday and a race on Sunday. And everything they had done the week before was now kind of irrelevant. They had to start all over again. They had to figure out how to communicate strategy and come up with a new strategy and do everything and do it at the right speed all over again. And as I point out in the communication world, there's kind of a parallel. I think you're only as good as your last communication. I mean, you think about it. How many people have an email from somebody that they saved from 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or a memo from your boss from 15 years ago? Because most of us don't have to do that because we're waiting for the next one that's coming up. If you're only as good as your last communication, I know that sounds like a negative, but it just reinforces the fact that how many of us are waiting to hear from somebody? But while this sounds negative, I also believe it's a positive. If you just reverse this and say, okay, you're only as good as your last communication, but that means you're also just as good as your next communication. And what I challenge people to do is when you leave this webinar, when you go out and go back out into your working world, we all have those people that for whatever reason we haven't communicated with. Maybe it's because we don't have the answer to their question. Maybe we just don't like them. We don't want to talk to them. Maybe we're waiting for some other bit of information or something else to happen. But you know what? Remember when I mentioned the fact that knowledge workers are spending 3.5 hours every week waiting for somebody to get back to them? What I challenge you to do is when you leave this webinar is to send one message. I don't care if it's a text message, an email, phone call, walk over to somebody and talk to them, whatever it may be. Communicate with somebody on something that you have intentionally not been communicating on, or something where you know somebody's waiting for you. And it may be as simple as, hey, I just want you to know, I don't have that information. I'm still waiting for somebody to get me that. In the meantime, just go off. We'll get back to that later. It's important that you at least reach out, get back up on the horse, as I always point out, and you get back in control of the situation. It's a great way to be able to gain control and feel like you're empowered, because it's very frustrating. I think it's stressful as well when you know you haven't communicated. And once again, maybe you're not communicating because somebody hasn't gotten back to you. But if you can communicate down the line so that others know there's a reason why the delay is happening, it doesn't mean you have to throw the other person under the bus, but you at least need to make people know that there's a reason why things are delayed. And that's really important to be able to understand. So I want to go off and talk about a few other concepts. And this is an interesting one. And this is why we're talking about the new normal. And I know my wife hates when I talk about the new normal. I know plenty of people who hate talking about the new normal. But to be honest with you, it's almost like saying I hate the internet. You can hate it all you want, but the new normal that we're going to have to deal with, especially for the next 6 months, does exist. So this term is a Japanese term, Kluge. And what it means is, translated roughly, it means can't read the air. In Japan, this is actually a saying. They refer to it as KY. People who are KY, they just don't know how to read kind of what's going on around them. It's usually for people who are socially awkward, is a good example. But the difficulty in our new normal is when you used to go into a meeting, into a room, wherever it may have been, you could walk in and you could read the room immediately. You could see the people who were sitting there. You could see whether they were having little click conversations off to the side, whether somebody was obviously angry and tapping his finger because somebody was late. You could read the air of the room. You could figure out exactly what you were walking into. Well, the difficulty now is when we live in a Zoom world is that you can't read the air. You can't look at everybody quickly and easily and size them all up and say, you know what, I believe that that guy's having a bad day. And I think that person's waiting for somebody and that person is staring at me, wondering what I'm going to say. You don't have the ability to read the air. So you have to come up with some alternate strategies to be able to figure out how to pull that off. And the most critical thing, I think, in this, when we are living in this remote world, goes back to what kind of a listener are you? Active listening is a concept that actually came out of the medical world. And what it refers to is listening in such a way that you're not just hearing, but you're actually processing as well. Now, I often point out, listening does not simply mean that you're quiet. It's not enough to be quiet. It's listening in such a way that you're actually internalizing the information and processing it. And this, once again, this comes out of the medical world. Active listening was a concept, I believe, that started back in the 1970s. And what they discovered specifically with EMTs is that there were two problems. First, it was being able to take in the information from the patient to make sure that they were actively listening to what the patient was saying so they understood what the issues were before the incident had happened. Was there any pre-existing problems, that kind of thing? And on the flip side, those paramedics were having to communicate with the hospitals as they were going towards the hospital. So the hospitals had to be able to actively listen so that they got that information as well. And obviously, lives are at stake here. So it's critical that the listening and the transferal of information and the communication be done just right. But the same tools that they used in that medical world that they use today are the same kinds of things that, frankly, we really need to be using in the business world. And what we first need to do is ask questions. So as we're listening, what we need to do is kind of process. And part of the problem in listening is that words come out of our mouth at about 125 words per minute. But our brain can process words at about 400 words per minute. So the problem is we've got this lag time, right? And the lag time is where, you know, your brain can kind of drift, you know, and yeah, you're hearing the words that are coming out, but your brain's processing in such a way that you're thinking, well, let's see, what am I doing for dinner? How's this going to affect the project I'm working on? Where am I going to go this weekend? Your brain can move forward, and the difficulty is trying to focus it. And so if you begin to think about not just what you're going to add to the conversation, because too many people do that. They think about, what am I going to add to this conversation? What you begin to want to think about is, how can I ask questions that will help to clarify the situation? As a reporter, I used to make my living, I joke, with these 6 questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. I discovered if you ask these 6 questions, you can pretty much get most of the information you need. Now, I will tell you that sometimes you have to ask the question why multiple times. Sometimes people will answer why, and they'll do it on a cursory level, and they'll ask why again in a little more in-depth way, and they'll answer. And so sometimes you have to use that question why again. But if you just use these 6 questions, you'd be amazed how many times you can get enough information to make sure that the communication happens properly back and forth. And I will also tell you that when there is a breakdown in communication, research shows that generally it's a result of what we refer to as the sender, the person giving the information probably hasn't done it properly, which means, you know, going back to the fact that, you know, we talk about being an active listener. If you're the listener, that means you need to account for the fact that the person who's giving you the information might not be doing it in the most effective and efficient way possible. So you have to assume that you need to ask clarifying questions on the back end. So once again, these 6 questions are critical in terms of your ability to communicate. And what you want to do after you ask those questions, you want to sum up. You want to say, okay, I've asked the questions. What we're saying is this how we're going to progress, so that you clarify. And as I always point out, it's almost like cleaning the window. You want to make sure that you're actually seeing what they're really wanting you to understand. So it's critical that if you actively listen, You ask the questions, you make sure that you summarize, clarify, and get to the point. And then if you have to do it over again, how many times have you left a meeting where you thought one thing happened and later you talked to somebody else who thought something else happened? It's just because it wasn't clarified properly. I go back to those 6 questions again. After you finish a phone call sometime, go through these 6 questions and see, you know what? Did I really answer all these? You'd be amazed how many times, and I've done this myself, how many times when I finish a conversation, I go back through these 6 questions and I think, you know, I didn't really answer those. This how one is left out there, or, you know, the when is left out there. I need to go back and clarify that one fact. I didn't summarize it properly. I can't see properly through the window to actually completely understand it. So it helps if you go through and make sure you do your active listening. And then this is a really interesting concept. What kind of communicator are you? Because the reality is we all communicate in different ways. There's a guy named Mark Hughes, I believe his name is, who has kind of a fun little test. And if you email me, I'll gladly send you a link to the test. I'm just rick@rickdebruhl.com. Here, I'll pop it up here so you can see it. Rick@rickdebruhl.com. I'll send you the link to it. And it's it's only about 13 questions. And it talks about what kind of communicator. It's a little test and it gives you a result. And the reality is, I like the way he does it. There's 4 different kinds of communicators in his world: analytical, personal, functional, and intuitive. Now, I can tell you that I am an intuitive listener, an intuitive communicator. What does it mean to be an intuitive communicator? It means I look down the road. I'm a big picture kind of guy. I'm really good at making gut level decisions, moving quickly in that direction. Don't bore me with numbers. Don't get all those little details in the way that are just going to really complicate and annoy the day. Now, you'll notice that the way this is designed, that the intuitive are on one side. Down on the opposite side are the functional communicators. The functional communicators are the opposite of the intuitives. Functional communicators, well, they love numbers. I mean, they just absolutely love numbers, to the point that they want to show you the math. They want to show you their calculus grade from high school. They might even bring in their calculus instructor because they love the numbers. They do, however, have a hard time adding the numbers up and taking a direction and making a move. The other 2 groups right there, analytical and personal. Analyticals are kind of a cross between intuitive and functionals. They want hard data. They want hard data, and they want to make decisions based on that hard data. They're capable of making those decisions based on the hard data. But on the opposite side of them are what are called personal communicators. And personal communicators, many people are simply going to refer to as the touchy-feely type communicators. And the problem with analyticals sometimes is that they don't bring any personal relationship into it. Personal communicators not only want to talk to you and listen to you, they might even want to hold your hand. When they start their communication with you, they're going to want to know, how's things going in your life? You know, how's your wife? I heard you had a problem. How's your husband? How's your kid? Whatever it may be. The analyticals, boy, they don't worry about that at all. They are moving down the road. They've got the numbers before them. They want everything based in foundation. The reality is, in a perfect world, you'd want to be that guy right in the center of all this, where, yeah, you're intuitive, you're analytical, you're personal, you're functional, you've got all those things that you can kind of work through. And so it becomes, how do you do that? Well, years ago, my wife and I were taking a skiing lesson, and we actually had a French skiing instructor. I remember him, his name was Richard. And Richard was making the point that he had this saying about skiing. He said, skiing is kneeing. That's Kneeing. And his point was pretty simple. He said, what we're talking about here is, as you ski down the slope, he wanted your knees to act like a shock absorber, to absorb everything that was going on the slopes. What he wanted was your head and your shoulders to stay steady. And if you ever watch professional skiers or Olympic skiers, that's exactly what they do. Their head, their shoulders stay relatively steady, and it's their knees and their legs that are absorbing everything. And I believe in the communication world that we essentially need to do the same thing. So let's go back and talk about these 4 types. The reality is, if you're intuitive, you're personal, you're analytical, you're probably not going to change what you are. What you are going to have to do is adapt to the other styles. You're going to keep your head and your shoulders steady because that's who you are. You're analytical. You need that. That's how you got where you are today. But if you aren't absorbing the way other people communicate, if you're not listening, actively listening to the way they're doing that, then you've got a problem. And let's go back to where we are within what we're going to once again call this new normal, where listening is so important and communicating is so important, especially when we can't see people. And before the pandemic started, there was research that showed remote workers don't feel connected to their organization. They oftentimes feel like they're being left out. A little more common because in the days before the pandemic, when everybody was at the office and there was a smaller percentage of people who were remote workers. But in essence, the same problem still exists today. You have people who are now working remotely, and as a result, because they're working remotely, they don't feel that they haven't had conversations with their other staff people, the other employees. They haven't maybe had the communications with their managers to the same degree that they had before. So what you have to do is you have to then begin to address, okay, how are all of these factors coming into this? What kind of communicator, or what kind of communicator is the manager? What kind of communicator is the employee? How can you adjust what you're doing to make sure that the style of communication that you're doing is effective? I've talked in the past about the fact that you're only as good as your last communication, and the fact that it's critical at this point in time that we over communicate. Someone once asked me, is it possible to communicate too much? And the reality is, yes, it is possible to communicate too much. But to be honest, very few people have that problem. It's kind of like baseball. In baseball, if a batter bats 300, they consider him, pretty good batter. That means 3 out of every 10 times that he comes to the plate, or every time the baseball player comes to the plate, they get a hit. But that means 7 out of 10 times they don't get a hit. And I believe that communication, quite frankly, is the same way. I believe that frankly, most of the time we don't do it as well as we possibly can. And as a result, we need to figure out ways to do it better. And at this point in time, we need to over communicate. How can you communicate more often with those above you and those below you? I will tell you that I believe that communication cultures work best when they start from above and work their way down. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that if you're in an organization where you don't have a CEO or executive director or supervisors or C-suite that are communicating effectively, you can say, well, our organization just doesn't communicate that well. Within every pod, within every group, within every sub-working culture, you also have the ability to make sure that your group is working and communicating well. Just because it's not working well above you doesn't mean you can take the excuse and say, well, you know what, it's not working well up there, we're just going to give up. In fact, what you can do is make your career more successful by improving the communication within your group. And as you improve the communication within your group, you can then show others how it can be done. And trust me, when your group is communicating well, people will notice. Now, I will tell you that just because you communicate well with a group at a project at a certain point in time does not mean that it will happen again. Because you think about it, you had a group of people that you got together, let's say a year ago, and they all communicated great. It was an amazing project. It just went along so spectacular. It was shocking how well things went. You get all those same group of people together in a room today, and all the dynamics have changed, right? I mean, first off, we have the pandemic. We have all these issues going on where people are no longer in the workplace. Suddenly you've got somebody who's working at home and maybe they've got 2 kids or 3 kids or a dog or whatever complication that's going on in their life. Or maybe they just have other issues going on within their life. Just because it's the same person doesn't mean they're now communicating at the same way they were communicating 1 year ago. So the difficulty is when you have a new project, you need to establish the new ways to communicate and make sure that the lines are working effectively, so that you can properly move forward. So remember, you're only as good as your last communication. You want that communication culture. You want that working effectively and efficiently. It has to be built into the organization. And while it can come from the top and it's the way it works best, it can also come from below. It can start within an individual group. It can start between 2 coworkers, then spread to 3, then spread to within a particular working group to a project group, and then spread beyond that. You want to be able to make sure that it grows. So having that communication culture, you want to remember to have the situation where you have the ability to communicate at the right speed. I can't stress enough how important this is. Too many times, people, when there is a crisis, don't react to the crisis in time. And yet when there's minor stuff, they move very quickly. And so it becomes, okay, make sure you look at what true deadlines are, so that when you have a true deadline, you're moving at the right speed. And when you don't have a true deadline, you're not creating artificial deadlines. And then finally, it's communicating the strategy. Make sure that you communicate the strategy. There's actually research that shows a lot of people in organizations don't actually know what the true mission of their organizations. They know what their job is, but they don't know what the true mission of the organization is. It's really important that you communicate the strategy all along the way. All right, go back to the end of the primary portion of what we're going to talk about today. As I mentioned, you reach me at rickdebruhl.com. rick@rickdebruhl.com is the easiest way to do it. I have written a book. It's called Communicating at the Right Speed, 52 Ways to Improve Your Professional Work Life. And it's available on Amazon. Reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about it. I work with groups dealing with messaging in terms of the sorry, I just remembered. I forgot to get back to the poll. We'll get back to the second. I have to work with messaging, crisis communication, personal communication, speech coaching. We're not doing a lot of speech coaching these days, but it is critical, even more critical in this Zoom world. But let's get back to our poll. Faustine, can you pop up the results of our poll? Interesting. 50% said stayed the same. 17% said it improved, and 33%, about a third, said it's gotten worse. It's interesting that 17% believe that it's improved. And if you want to hop in the chat session, I'd love to know why those 17% said it improved. Stay the same. I think that's really a great achievement. If you can stay the same in this environment, I think you've achieved a huge, huge goal right there. And if it's gotten worse, to be honest with you, it's not a big surprise, because I think that the current pandemic that we're living in and the current world we're living in just complicates things. And trying to stay the same, I think, is a little bit complicated. It's interesting, though, some people prefer to work at home. And as a result, it does complicate it. It's just so let's see. Kimberly is saying, I think the frequency of our team communicating is increasing. And that's a good thing. I mean, when you think, but somebody has to be responsible for that. So the good thing, Kimberly, within your organization is the fact that somebody is actually saying, okay, we need to have more communication. And because too often what happens is people begin to work on their own, and they begin to have that fall apart. So if you're increasing the amount of communication, I think that's a great thing. And I think frankly, that's a great achievement for your organization. I think it's the kind of thing that everybody needs to realize is something that really has to happen. Anybody else want to add any comments in there? Yeah, once again, if you can stay the same, you've made a major achievement. If you've improved, I got to say, I got to give you credit. The difficulty is trying to, it's one thing when you first go off on your own and you have more employees working initially. Can you maintain that? That becomes a little more complicated. Well, once again, communicating at the right speed. Let's see, more communication taking place with the entire staff rather than just between smaller teams. That's from Christina. So that's interesting as well. It's always important to realize that's why those things are happening. So that's good. So once again, communicating at the right speed, that's the theme. If you want to get a hold of me, feel free to do so. And Faustine, we can open it up for other questions.
Yes, so if you have any questions for Rick, please write them in the chat option. We can answer those. We can go ahead and ask you our first question. Let's see, what are some books you can recommend on communicating effectively and building strategies?
Oh boy, I tell you, well, okay, I'm going to be just a little self-serving here, but I'm going to go with this one right here, Communicating at the Right Speed. This is the book I wrote. So this book is about, I use what I call micro learning. Most people, I believe, don't have time to sit and read a big, huge, thick book, right? So this book is 52 micro lessons. Each lesson is an essay with study questions associated with it. You can read the entire book in less than an hour. The essays only take a couple minutes to read. But when you do the questions associated with them, what you actually begin to look at is how you are performing in these areas. For example, one of the essays is called, are you an elephant or a hippo? And an elephant, for example, has big ears and a little tiny mouth. A hippo, on the other hand, has little tiny ears and a great big mouth. When you go into a meeting, are you the person who dominates it and you're always talking, or are you the elephant who's listening? So it's just one of those things. And what I challenge people to do is they go through and read that particular section For the following week, what I challenge them to do is, how do you perform in the meetings? Try to be the elephant this week instead of the hippo. Beyond that, boy, I tell you what, there are tons of great books. I literally collect communication books, and for whatever reason right now, I can't think of any others, but there's tons of good ones out there. Like I say, mine, obviously the first one come to mind. I wish I could think of some others, but if you'll send me your email, I'll send you a couple good suggestions.
Great, thank you.
I do have one right off the bat. Critical Conversations. Critical Conversations was a New York Times bestseller. They also have an audiobook version of it. Critical Conversations. It looks at conversations across the full spectrum, whereas I only deal in business communication. It talks about both business communication and personal communication as well.
Awesome, thank you, Rick. How many pages is your book, can I ask? Do you know off the top of your hand?
It's about 110 pages or so. It's relatively
Okay.
quick. Like I say, it's designed around microlearning. I think people these days don't have a lot of time to read.
Yes, I can totally agree. I totally agree. Let's see, we have a question coming in. Is it okay to cancel meetings when there's nothing to communicate? Or is it better to pivot to a meeting to personally communicate with one another to build relationships during this time?
Boy, that's a tough one. Because I will say that definitely building relationships in a virtual world, I think, is critical in understanding how people communicate. But at the same time, I think ultimately, meetings that don't have a solid agenda only frustrate people. If you're, if you're going to pivot to something that has some substance, absolutely go for it. But if there isn't a reason to do it, then I think you do need to cancel it. Because here's the problem. This goes back to communicating at the right speed. If you have every meeting just because it's scheduled, then people begin to go, well, that last meeting I attended really wasn't worthwhile, so I don't want to do it. You want to make sure that people know that if they go to a meeting, that something's going to be achieved. Just as, I used to work for an organization where every meeting was scheduled for an hour. It's like, well, stop scheduling meetings for an hour. I know I had to deal with the Arizona Supreme Court for quite a bit. And it seemed like every meeting they scheduled was scheduled for 90 minutes. Like, schedule 5-minute meetings, 15-minute meetings, 10-minute meetings, hour-long meetings. Schedule meetings to go the length of time that you need to work on the situation or the issue, the project at hand. If you're just routinely scheduling meetings for half an hour, then people begin to go, well, that's really only a 5-minute thing. I don't think I'm going to waste my time going to it. Now, is there team building that can happen in a virtual world? Absolutely. But you know what? If you want to do team building, then do a team building meeting and make that the focus of the meeting, as opposed to, well, we were going to do a meeting on this, now we're just going to do team building. Make team building sound like something that is going to be functional and the reason to have the meeting, as opposed to, well, we didn't have anything to do, so now we're doing team building.
Great, thank you, Rick. What are your thoughts about having big, large meetings with more than 100 employees?
So I believe that virtual town halls are critical today, because the ability to have the CEO, the C-suite, the supervisors, the executive vice president, whoever it may be, communicate in a larger way is really important. Too many times, I often talk about the telephone game. We've all played it, right? We have the telephone game where somebody says something at one end of a room, it gets passed to the others, and by the time it reaches the other end of the line, the message has changed. When you think about it, that's the same way we work in the corporate world. The CEO says something, the C-suite gets involved, then it goes to the executive leadership, then it goes to the supervisors, the managers, and then finally the frontline people. And who knows how many other levels are in there. When you think about it, that's really a poor way of running communication. The ability for the C-suite to talk more directly to a larger group is really more important. So to have a virtual town hall where you can have, now that doesn't mean that it has to be fully interactive. There's different ways of doing it. Virtual town halls, although, are great where people can add in, but don't expect a meeting with 100 people to be a project meeting. That's just not a functional way of doing that. Could you do a 5-minute update meeting or a 10-minute or whatever it may be? Hey, just want you to know, we've got all 100 people on the project on board here or across the country. Here's where we are, boom, 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 and then move on and address it elsewhere in smaller groups. But the idea of having a big meeting, because let's go back to that research that talked about the fact that so many employees before the pandemic started, when they were working remotely, felt left out. If you can figure out a way to make sure that employees are getting the correct information and feel included in what's going on, I think it's effective. So virtual town halls, I think, are very, very important to have in this pandemic era. Don't expect a virtual town hall or a meeting with 100 people to be a functional, effective meeting at solving logistical problems or working on a project.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Any way to fight Zoom fatigue when we are in meetings 6 to 8 hours a
Oh,
day now?
I got to tell you, it can be brutal. I mean, you think about it, but I would argue that this is where organizations, I think, need to streamline what they do. And it goes back to, just because you can schedule a meeting for 30 minutes doesn't mean you need to. Maybe it's a 5-minute meeting. Just because you can schedule a meeting for an hour doesn't mean you need to. I wish I had a great solution, because everybody's sitting at their desk staring into their Zoom meetings. I mean, there are some games you can do to make them a little bit more interactive, but at the same time, you still have the basic problem of, staring into the computer and thinking, well, I could actually be working on my project right now. I think, schedule meetings for the amount of time that it takes to do it, and don't be afraid to end a meeting early. We had an agenda of 7 items. It was scheduled for an hour. We're going to get through them all in 35 minutes, call it quits and move on. Don't feel the need to continue that hour-long meeting just because you scheduled it.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the questions that I see that have come in. Um, don't see any other last minute questions, but thank you again, Rick, for taking time out of your busy day to present our webinar. I hope all of our attendees found the information valuable. Thank you everyone for attending who has dialed in today. This webinar was recorded, so if you do need to review the information or watch it, it will be available 1 to 2 business days on events.bbbcommunity.org. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. Please stay safe out there and stay healthy.